Hi, I'm Parni Jaggi, and in this series of videos on John Donne, we're going to be talking about a very popular and important poet of English literature who was actually a pioneer in writing metaphysical poetry in the 16th century, and that is John Donne. So, before we look into the poetry of John Donne, we need to know a little bit about his life, his personal life, his literary life, and his works as to why he is still read today. So John Donne was born in 1572 in London, England, and is known as the founder of the metaphysical poetry, the school of poetry. This term was actually created later on in 18th century by Samuel Johnson, a famous essayist, poet and philosopher. But John Donne wrote in 16th century in England. And he led the metaphysical school of poetry. What was the school of poetry actually? This was a group of intellectuals who were also poets. And this group included poets like George Herbert, Richard Crashaw, Andrew Marvell, John Cleveland, Lovelace, and so on. Now, these metaphysical poets are actually known for their ability to startle, to surprise the reader, and coax new perspectives through paradoxical images, very fine, subtle arguments, inventive syntax, and imagery taken from art, philosophy, and religion, using an extended metaphor, also known as a metaphysical conceit, about which we will read while we go through his poetry. Now, while we read about his life, we see that it was not a very smooth and an easy life that he led. Born into a Roman Catholic Christian family, John Donne's personal relationship with religion was actually tumultuous and passionate, and was the center of much of his poetry. He studied at both Oxford and Cambridge universities in his early teen years, although he did not take a degree at either of these schools. At 20 years of age, he studied law at Lincoln's Inn, and 2 years later, he succumbed to the religious pressures and joined the Anglican Church instead of the Roman Catholic Church after his younger brother, who was convicted for his Catholic loyalties, died in prison. Now, John Donne wrote most of his love poems, his lyrics, his erotic verse, and some sacred poems in 1590s that created two major volumes of his works, satires and songs and sonnets. In 1598, after returning from a 2-year naval expedition against Spain, John Donne was appointed private secretary to Sir Thomas Egerton. Now, this was a significant event in his life. While sitting in Queen Elizabeth's last parliament in 1601, Donne secretly married his beloved, the girl named Anne More. She was a 16-year-old niece of Lady Egerton. Now, this was not actually approved by Donne's father-in-law. The marriage was not happily completed or attended by his in-laws, and as punishment, his father-in-law even had him briefly imprisoned. Now, because of this marriage, the couple was isolated and were completely dependent on their friends, relatives, and patrons. So as a result, Donne suffered heavy social and financial instability in the years that followed his marriage, and also because of the birth of his many children. He continued to write and published the volume Divine Poems in 1607. In Pseudo Mater, published in 1610, John Donne displayed his extensive knowledge of the laws of the church and state, arguing that Roman Catholics could support James I without actually compromising their faith. And in 1615, James I pressured him to enter the Anglican ministry by declaring that John Donne could not be employed outside the church. So he was appointed the royal chaplain that year. Now, a very tragic event of his life was again when his wife died in 1617 at an early age. She was just 33 years old, while shortly giving birth to their 12th child. The volume Holy Sonnets are also attributed to this phase of his life. After his wife died, he turned to religion and wrote the Holy Sonnets. In 1621, he became Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, and in his later years, his writings reflected his fear of his inevitable death. He wrote his private prayers, devotions upon emergent occasions during a period of severe illness, and published them in 1624. His learned, charismatic, and inventive preaching made him a highly influential person in London of those times. Best known for his vivacious, compelling style and also for the examination of paradoxes in poetry, he is still known as a great writer. He died in London on March 31st, 1631. So we know John Donne as a poet of love poems, holy poems, and metaphysical poems. So what exactly is metaphysical poetry and how John Donne is the greatest metaphysical poet? We will be looking into this topic in the coming videos, so stay tuned. Thank you for now.